you ever thought about our calendar? It's kind of messed up. I mean, it's accurate and it's good calendar and people have made it as good as we can, but there's a lot of historical junk in our calendar that's kind of messed up. I mean, just as a off the top of my head, did you ever notice that September is Latin for seventh month, but it's the ninth month, and October is Latin for the eighth month, and it's the 10th month, and November is Latin for the ninth month, but it's the 11th month, and December is Latin for the 10th month, but it's the 12th month? Yeah. Have you also wondered why it's February that's a really short month, why it's so gimpy? Well, there's actually historical answers for a lot of this. Let me go way back. Before 600 CE, the Romans had a calendar. And the calendar was based on lunar months. And it was really about rituals. They needed to know when to do the right rituals. And so the calendar actually didn't describe the whole year. It was just 10 months. And it was, there was no month of January or February. They simply went from March to December, and because that was the ritual calendar of the seasons and the et cetera, and they thought nothing happened in January and February, and so they didn't have any rituals in it, so they just left the calendar blank for that. But of course, that's a problem, and so in 600 CE, they finally added January and February, okay? But at the end of the year, because the year started in March, but they still left the months really short. So it wasn't actually a 365-day calendar; it was a 355-day calendar. But adding January and February at the end was okay because it kept all the numbered months. And in fact, July was Sixtus, and I'm sorry, July was Quintus, and August was Sixtus, and September, etc. And so it was more accurate, but it was still wildly off. And in particular, it got so far off of it was 10 days off. So every couple of years, the Romans would just sort of randomly add what they called an intercalary month, a month after February that just sort of moved the whole calendar back to being right. But they didn't. It wasn't a regular month. They just put it in whenever. And actually, it was set by the government. And so the Roman leaders would often abuse this because they had a one-year term, and they would add an intercalary month to give themselves another month in power. So all this was a mess until finally Julius Caesar, when he became Roman, a dictator, emperor, etc., in the 1st century BCE, decided to fix it. He had come across a better calendar in Egypt when he was there, and so in 45 BCE, he adopted what came to be called the Julian calendar after Julius Caesar. And the Julian calendar did a number of things. One is it moved the first day of the year to January 1st. Okay, so it went from March to January. And that's why September, October, November, December are all named wrong, because they were the 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th months. But then when you move New Year's Day back to January, they all they're all named wrong now. But in addition, he lengthened the months so that you would have 365 days a year. But he knew that that actually wasn't quite right. He was pretty sure that the new year was 365.24 days, but they rounded that up to 0.25. So he said, okay, so every year is 365 days plus a quarter. So let's just add an extra day every 4 years. And so he introduced the leap year, which every 4th year added a day at the end of February. Because February was the traditional month that you had always added things, because that used to be the last month of the year, even though it wasn't anymore. But then he also moved stuff around, and this is when, for instance, August got 31 days, and he started to move days around to lengthen out to 365, but he didn't give February those days. Julius Caesar, of course, also decided to rename the 5th month, which is now the 7th month, as Julius, after himself, and so that becomes July for us. So July is named after Julius Caesar. And then later, the Roman Emperor Caesar Augustus, who came after Caesar, Julius Caesar, decided to rename a month after himself. So the month of Sixtus, or the 6th month, became August. And of course, it had to be August, because he had to have a long month, so 31 days. Because he couldn't have a shorter month than Julius Caesar, because that would mean Caesar Augustus was less important than Julius Caesar, and we can't have a shorter month. So this is the Julian calendar, and it works pretty well. It covers it's pretty close to the actual year, but it's a little bit off. In fact, it gets a little bit off. It's off by about 11 minutes a year. And so, and you might say, oh, 11 minutes, no big deal. But that means that every 400 years, the calendar is now off by 3 whole days. Now you might say, well, what's it matter if it's off by 3 whole days? But this was actually really important for the Catholic Church because Easter is set as the first Sunday after the first full moon after Lent, and it's tied up to the vernal equinox. And so they needed to know exactly when the equinox was. And the equinox, when day and night are exactly the same length, has to fall on the same date on the calendar year if your calendar is right. Well, they began to realize that it was way off. They knew that equinox was supposed to be on March 21st, but it was now happening 10 days off. And so they realized they really had to fix this for religious purposes. To get Easter right, you had to fix the calendar. So in 1582, the Pope, Gregory, introduces his reforms, which are called introduce the Gregorian calendar. And what Gregory does essentially is he moves the calendar forward 10 days. He skips forward 10 days. And he does that so that you can get the equinox back on the right day. Then what Gregory does is he changes the leap years so that they're more correct. He says that it's okay, you have a leap year every 4 years, but then on years that end in, they're divisible by 100, you don't have a leap year, but if they're divisible by 400, you do have a leap year. And what this does is it adjusts the length of the year just slightly so that it actually shortens the year slightly so that it now matches up pretty darn close to the actual length of the year on Earth. But what's interesting, so the Catholic Church starts using this, and a lot of Catholic countries adopt the Gregorian calendar pretty soon, right after 1582. So in the early 1600s, all the Catholic countries in Europe are on the Gregorian calendar. But the Protestant countries and Eastern Orthodox countries were not interested in taking a calendar from the Pope. They did not agree with the Pope. They did not like the Pope. The Protestant Reformation had split apart the Catholic Church. The Eastern Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church had excommunicated each other in the 1000s. And so they refused to adopt this. And so over time, what actually happened was that the two calendars got farther and farther apart. The Julian calendar kept falling farther and farther behind, and the Gregorian calendar kept sort of moving in front. And this actually brings up some interesting issues. One is that England finally decides in the 1750s that they have to adopt the Catholic calendar, even though it's Catholic. But by this point, they're aware that it's scientifically accurate, and that's a better argument than it just being Catholic. And so in England in 1752, they decide to adopt the Gregorian calendar, and to do that, they have to jump forward 11 days. Now, they also had not been using January 1st, so they had to bump New Year's Day back to January 1st. So they did both things simultaneously, and this messed up everything, of course, right? It messed up when people got paid, it messed up when lawsuits were supposed to happen, it messed up contracts, it messed up all this stuff. Anything that had dates in it was all messed up. But this actually had an interesting effect because it screwed up George Washington. You're going to say, well, what's George Washington have to do with it? Well, George Washington was born on February 11, 1731, under the old Julian calendar, which means that when England adopted the new Gregorian calendar in 1752, George Washington was 21 years old. In fact, in England, they jumped ahead from September 2nd to September 14th, 1752. They just erased those days. So you went to bed on September 2nd, you woke up on September 14th. But one of the interesting things about this is at the same time, they had moved the date, the first day of the year, back to January 1st. Now, that meant that George Washington's birth year actually changed when they switched calendars. So he turned 21 under the old Julian calendar on February 11th of 1752, but then they suddenly, when they moved the date back, he was suddenly born a year later because instead of being born in February of 1731, that January and February now counted as the beginning of 1732, and so he was suddenly only 20 years old again. And so the English actually had to pass a law saying that anybody whose birthday got messed up like this, because turning 21 was a big thing in the American colonies were under the British system. In the British system, 21 was the age of majority at that time. So George Washington had turned legally an adult in February, then he gets undone and becomes not legally adult in September. And so they passed a law saying, a special law saying, anybody born in that period was actually an adult already. And so he got to keep being 21, so to speak, even though he was only 20 now under the Gregorian calendar. And in fact, if you look it up today, his birth date is usually listed as February 22nd, 1732, which is the new Gregorian date, even though his whole time growing up, he had thought his birthday was February 11th, 1731. But what's interesting is the Eastern Orthodox Church still resisted adopting the Catholic calendar. And so Eastern European countries stayed on the Julian calendar up until the 20th century. One of the weird things about the calendar is that if you look at Russia, they were still on, when the Russian Revolution broke out in 1917, the Russians were still on the Julian calendar, which was by that point 12 or 13 days, I think 13 days behind the Gregorian calendar. And so when Russia actually had a revolution in late February of 1917, the rest of the world thought it was happening in March. And so the so-called Russian February Revolution actually happened in March. And then when they had a second revolution, when the Bolsheviks took power in October under the Julian calendar, that actually happened in November. So the October Revolution happened in November, and the February Revolution happened in March. And it was only later that the communists adopted the Gregorian calendar. Greece was actually the last country in Europe to adopt the Gregorian calendar, adopted it in 1923. So overall, if you look at our calendar, it's got all sorts of marks of historical change. I mean, the fact that September, October, November, and December are named wrong shows that when they moved the first of the year. The fact that February is a short month is a relic of it used to being the old end of the year. The leap years have changed. And throughout history, dates have changed because people have adopted the calendar at different times, as George Washington could tell you. If you like this video, please subscribe and look for more videos in the future. We'll have them coming out regularly.